daytime, there could be, he would start riots and stuff, and crowds would gather real quickly, and he'd get trapped and have to sign 1 million autographs.
A passport belonging to Elvis Presley spent over 4 decades buried inside a federal archive, and no one had flagged it. Inside it was a single stamp from a country he had never publicly visited, dated while he was still alive, but someone had hidden it intentionally. The question is who and what they needed to keep secret. An incomplete historical record. The Federal Records Facility sat on the edge of a mid-sized government campus, the kind of building that most people drove past without a second glance. It held millions of documents from decades of government activity, tax records, court filings, agency correspondence, and the kind of administrative paperwork that built up over generations. Most of what was stored there would never be looked at again. It was the nature of the place. Things arrived, got filed, and stayed that way. The building was not designed for discovery, it was designed for storage. The archivist assigned to the latest inventory review had been working through a backlog of uncatalogued boxes from a specific federal department. The project had been ongoing for months, and the work was thorough. Each box had to be opened, each item logged, each document cross-referenced against existing records. It was the kind of slow, careful work that required patience more than anything else. Most of what turned up was exactly what the labels on the outside of the boxes suggested, but not every box was what it appeared to be. The box in question had arrived at the facility as part of a larger transfer from a government office that had been reorganized in the early 1980s. It had been logged under a broad category heading and placed on a shelf where it remained for over 4 decades. Nothing about the exterior of the box flagged it as unusual. The transfer paperwork that came with it was standard. There was no reason for anyone to have prioritized it. The facility held thousands of boxes that had been sitting for just as long, and most of them contained nothing extraordinary. When the archivist opened the box, the contents were mostly what the category heading suggested. Administrative documents from a federal department that had handled requests related to public figures during a specific period. Travel authorizations, correspondence with security agencies, and processing records from the early 1970s made up the bulk of the material. The documents were aged but intact. The archivist began logging each one in sequence, moving through the box with efficiency until one item near the bottom stopped the process entirely. The passport was in a plain envelope that had not been sealed. It had no additional markings on the outside beyond a case reference number that had been written in pencil. When the archivist removed the document and opened it, the name and photograph made it immediately clear that this was not an ordinary piece of paperwork. The photograph carried one of the most recognized faces in American history. The name printed in the document was Elvis Aaron Presley. The archivist set the passport flat on the table and did not move it again until the department supervisor had been contacted. The internal review that followed began within days. The first question was, how had a passport belonging to one of the most famous Americans of the 20th century ended up in a federal archive without any record of why it had been placed there or by whom? The passport had never been listed in any inventory at the facility. It had not been formally transferred as part of any legal process connected to Elvis's estate. There was nothing inside the box that explained its presence, and the penciled case number on the envelope did not correspond to any active or closed file in the department's own records. The estate of Elvis Presley had gone through an extensive legal and administrative process following his demise in August 1977. Graceland and all associated properties had been well managed, and the documentation surrounding his personal effects had been handled through formal legal channels. A passport belonging to Elvis should have been accounted for in that process. The fact that it had not been, and that it had instead surfaced in a federal box years later, means that someone had removed it from the normal chain of custody before his estate was ever settled. Federal archivists began tracing the provenance of the box as much as the available records allowed. The department that had originally packed and transferred the box no longer existed in its original form. The reorganization that had sent the box to the facility had also dispersed the staff who had worked in that office. Personnel records from that period were incomplete, and there was no way to identify which individual had been responsible for packing the specific box that held the passport. The trail went cold before it reached any person or decision. What the review did establish was a rough timeline. The box had been packed sometime between 1977 and 1982. based on the dates of other documents inside it. That window placed the packing of the box within years of Elvis's passing. Someone with access to a federal office had placed his passport into a box of administrative documents during that period, and it had sat undisturbed ever since. The archivist who found it had no authority to draw conclusions about what that meant. Meanwhile, the supervisor who reviewed the find reported the matter to the appropriate Federal Records Authority, and the passport was removed from the general inventory pending further review. The news that a lost passport belonging to Elvis Presley had turned up in a federal archive did not stay contained within the walls of the facility for long. Word moved through the records community at first, and then more broadly as the significance of the find became clear. But what drew the most attention was not simply that the passport had been found, it was what was inside it, the ghost passport. The standard process for issuing a United States passport in the 1970s was well detailed. An applicant submitted a formal request, provided identification and photographs, and waited for the document to be processed through the appropriate federal channels. For private citizens, the process was routine. For public figures who traveled with security details and whose movements required coordination with federal agencies, the process involved additional layers of oversight. Every step left a paper trail, and that trail was supposed to be permanent. Elvis Presley had a documented travel history that his management, his security team, and various federal agencies had tracked for years. His trips abroad were rare compared to the volume of his domestic activity, but the ones that had taken place were accounted for. There were records of coordination with foreign governments, arrangements made through official channels, and documentation that placed him in specific locations at specific times. His life had been lived almost entirely in public, and even his private movements had been surrounded by enough people to make complete secrecy nearly impossible. The passport recovered from the Federal Archive did not match the documented record, although proper assessment of the passport confirmed that the physical document itself was genuine. The paper, the ink, the binding, and the official markings were all consistent with a legitimately issued United States passport from the period in question. It had not been forged or altered in any way that the examiners could detect. The document was real. What it represented, however, did not align with anything in the known official record of how Elvis's travel documentation had been handled. The issue was one of duplication. Elvis was known to have held a passport that had been used for his documented foreign travel. That document had been accounted for in various ways over the years, and its existence had never been in question. The passport found in the archive appeared to be a second document, issued separately, processed through a different channel, and never entered into the same administrative records as the first. However, two passports issued to the same individual was not unheard of in certain circumstances, but those circumstances were specific and required formal justification. No such justification appeared in any file connected to Elvis Presley's name. The circumstances under which a second passport could have been issued pointed in a limited number of directions. A replacement could have been issued if the original had been reported lost or damaged, but there was no record of such a report being made. A second passport could also have been issued to allow travel to countries that might have refused entry based on stamps already present in the first document, but that explanation required a specific kind of authorization and left its own paper trail. A third possibility existed, one that investigators were slower to approach, which was that the second passport had been issued with the intent of keeping certain travel off the official record. The photograph inside the passport showed Elvis as he appeared in the early 1970s, which helped narrow the window during which the document had been issued. The physical details recorded in the passport, height, date of birth, place of birth, precisely matched his known biographical information. There were no errors or inconsistencies in the personal data. The document had been issued in his real name for his actual identity through what appeared to be a legitimate federal process. It had simply never been acknowledged. Whoever had processed the application had done so using accurate information, which meant the application had not been submitted under false pretenses. The question of who would have had the means and the access to arrange a second passport for Elvis without it appearing in the standard record required understanding how closely his life was managed during that period. His affairs were handled by a small and tightly controlled group of people. Major decisions about his schedule, his travel, and his public and private appearances passed through a very limited number of hands. For a document of this nature to have been processed without the knowledge of his broader circle would have required either the cooperation of someone very close to him or the involvement of an outside party with federal access operating independently of his management structure. Neither of those explanations was comfortable, and neither could be confirmed or ruled out with the documents available. The archive contained the passport, but not the application that had been used to generate it. Requests to locate the original processing paperwork through federal records channels produced no results. The application, if it had ever existed in a retrievable form, was either lost in the same reorganization that had sent the passport to the archive or had been removed from the records separately. What remained was a finished document with no visible origin, a passport that the system had produced but apparently never wanted to acknowledge. The examiners completed their assessment and submitted a formal report to the Federal Records Authority overseeing the review. The report confirmed the document's authenticity, noted the absence of any corresponding application on file, and flagged the duplicate status as an unresolved administrative anomaly. But beneath the careful language was a finding that pointed to something that routine administrative error could not easily explain. A second passport had been issued for Elvis Presley, and no one in the official record had ever seen fit to say so. The unexplained stamp. A passport stamp was one of the most basic instruments of international record keeping. When a traveler crossed a border, the entry point was recorded, the date was marked, and the document became a physical log of movement across national lines. For most travelers, those stamps accumulated over years of ordinary trips and held no particular significance beyond personal history. If for someone like Elvis Presley, whose every public movement had been documented by an army of observers, a passport stamp was not just a record of travel, it was evidence. The stamp found inside the recovered passport occupied a single page toward the middle of the document. The pages around it were blank. No other stamps, no visas, no additional markings of any kind. The stamp itself was rectangular, with text in both English and a foreign language, and it included a date and the name of an entry point. Document specialists examining it confirmed that the ink and the impression were consistent with stamps used by the issuing country's border authority during the relevant period. The stamp had not been added after the fact. It had been applied at an actual point of entry by a border official on an actual date. The country named in the stamp was not one that appeared anywhere in Elvis Presley's known travel history. His documented foreign trips had taken him to a small number of destinations, all of them well recorded and widely known. The country represented by this stamp was not among them. It was not a destination that had ever been mentioned in connection with Elvis by any member of his inner circle, any journalist who covered his career, or any biographer who had written about his life. There was no concert book there, no film project connected to it, no public or private relationship that would have drawn him to that location. The date on the stamp placed the entry during a specific window in the mid-70s. Cross-referencing that date against Elvis's known schedule for that period showed no obvious gap. His calendar for those years had been densely packed with professional commitments, and the periods between engagements had generally been spent at Graceland or at one of his other properties. The date of the stamp fell within a stretch of time that his official record accounted for, in a general way, but not with the kind of day-by-day specificity that would have made a brief overseas trip impossible. The entry point named in the stamp was a mid-sized international facility rather than a major hub. That detail was significant for several reasons. A major international airport would have had higher foot traffic and stricter record keeping, making undetected passage harder. A smaller entry point would have offered a greater degree of operational discretion. People with the means and the motivation to move a high-profile individual across a border without drawing attention would have had reasons to prefer exactly the kind of location named in the stamp. The choice of entry point, in other words, appeared deliberate. No exit stamp from the same country appeared anywhere in the passport. The page with the entry stamp was the only evidence that the border had been crossed at all. An exit stamp could have been placed in a different travel document, or it was possible that the exit had occurred through a channel that did not require one. Some border crossings during that era were less concerned about recording departures than arrivals, but the absence of an exit record meant that the stamp told only half the story. It confirmed that someone holding this passport had entered the country on that date. It said nothing about how long they had stayed or how they had left. The passport offered no other clues about the nature of the visit. There were no handwritten notes in the margins, no attached documents, no additional markings that pointed to a hotel, a meeting, or any specific activity on the ground. What the stamp recorded was an entry and nothing more. Everything that happened after that entry, who was met, where they went, what was discussed, and when they departed, existed entirely outside the document. The stamp was the beginning of a story that the passport was not equipped to finish. Attempts to verify the entry through the records of the country in question ran into significant obstacles. The border authority that had operated the named entry point during the 1970s had undergone multiple reorganizations in the decades since, and its historical records from that period were incomplete. A formal inquiry returned no corresponding entry record for the date in question. That absence was not conclusive. Record losses from that era were common, particularly for smaller facilities that had not yet transitioned to electronic systems. What made the stamp impossible to dismiss was precisely its ordinariness. It was not unusual in appearance. It looked exactly like every other legitimate border entry stamp from that country in that period. If someone had intended to fabricate evidence of travel, they had done so with a level of accuracy and restraint that made the fabrication indistinguishable from the real thing. And if the stamp was real, if someone holding Elvis Presley's passport had really entered that country on that date, then an entire chapter of his life had taken place completely outside the record. What the stamp points to understanding what the stamp meant required stepping back from the document itself and examining the broader circumstances of Elvis Presley's life during the years it covered. The mid-1970s had been a period of private difficulty for him. His professional schedule remained packed, with touring commitments that stretched across months and left little room for genuine rest. Behind the performances, his health had been declining in ways that the people around him were aware of, but that the public had not been told. The state of his personal affairs during that period was closely managed. His inner circle controlled access to him carefully, and the flow of information about his condition and his activities was tightly restricted. Outside observers saw only what that circle permitted them to see. The gap between the image he projected on stage and the reality of his daily life had grown wider with each passing year, and some of what happened during that period still had not been fully accounted for decades later. The stamp existed within that larger context of incomplete information. The country named in the stamp had a specific profile that was relevant to the questions being asked. During the 1970s, it was known for hosting a particular kind of private medical practice, one that catered to wealthy international clients who sought treatments that were either experimental, legally restricted in their home countries, or simply not available through normal channels. These facilities operated outside the mainstream of Western medicine, and they attracted patients who had both the financial resources to travel and strong reasons for wanting their visits kept quiet. His documented health struggles during the years surrounding the stamp's date had been the subject of major scrutiny after his demise. The official account of his medical history was well known in broad outline, but the specific details of treatments he had pursued, consultations he had sought, and interventions that had been attempted were not fully established in the public record. His personal physicians had managed his care, but the management of his care had not always followed standard medical practice. The possibility that someone in his circle had identified a foreign treatment option and arranged for him to pursue it quietly was consistent with how decisions about his health were being made during that period. The logistical requirements of moving Elvis Presley across an international border without triggering public attention would have been substantial, but not impossible. Private aviation had been used throughout his career to manage his movements discreetly, and his organization had experience coordinating with federal authorities on travel arrangements. A trip lasting only a few days, short enough to fit between scheduled commitments without creating an obvious gap in his calendar, could have been managed by a very small number of people. The use of a second passport, separate from his official travel document, would have been aligned with an effort to keep the trip off any record that might later be reviewed. However, the involvement of a federal channel in the issuance of the second passport raised a separate but related question. During the early 1970s, Elvis had cultivated a personal relationship with federal law enforcement that was unusual for a private citizen. He had sought and received credentials that gave him a formal connection to certain federal agencies, and that connection had involved to have meetings with senior officials and an exchange of goodwill that went beyond celebrity novelty. Whether that relationship extended to the kind of assistance that would have facilitated the issuance of a second passport was unknown, but the connection itself was documented and the proximity was real. What the stamp pointed to, when all of those threads were considered together, was a coherent possibility. Someone with access to federal channels had arranged for a legitimate second passport to be issued in Elvis's name. That passport had been used for at least one trip to a country known for discreet private medical services. The trip had taken place during a period when his health was a serious and private concern, and the passport had subsequently been placed inside a government box and stored in a federal facility, well outside the reach of the people who had managed his affairs. Each of those facts was individually documentable. Together, they described something that looked very much like a deliberate effort to move him somewhere for a specific reason, and then to make sure that the evidence of that movement stayed hidden. Even at that, the document examiners and records specialists involved in the review were careful to stay within the boundaries of what the physical evidence could actually support. They had a stamp, a passport, and a set of contextual details that pointed in a particular direction. What they did not have was a record of what had happened on the ground, who had accompanied him, what had been sought, and whether whatever had been attempted had made any difference at all to the way his final years unfolded. The stamp recorded an arrival. Everything after that arrival remained somewhere else entirely. In the memories of people who had not spoken, or in documents that had not yet surfaced, or in the gap between what was known and what had actually happened. Questions that remain unanswered. The Federal Records Authority completed its initial review of the passport and submitted its findings to the appropriate oversight body. The report confirmed the document's authenticity, documented the unexplained entry stamp, noted the absence of any corresponding application or processing record, and recommended that the passport be placed in restricted access pending further investigation. The passport moved from the general inventory into a secure holding category, and the archivist who had found it was informed that the matter was now being handled at a higher level. The review, as far as the facility was concerned, was over. The people who had been closest to Elvis during his final years were still alive when the passport was found, or had only recently passed away. Some had spoken at length about their time with him over the decades since his passing. Others had remained largely private, giving few interviews and declining most requests to revisit that period of their lives. When the existence of the passport and the stamp began to circulate among those who tracked developments in Elvis scholarship, inquiries reached several individuals who had been part of his inner circle during the relevant years. The responses those inquiries produced were notable for what they failed to resolve. Some individuals said they had no memory of a trip to the country named in the stamp during the period in question. Others acknowledged that there had been times when Elvis's whereabouts were not shared with everyone around him, and that decisions about his schedule and his private activities were made by a very small group without necessarily informing the broader circle. None of the people contacted were able to confirm the trip. None of them were able to flatly rule it out either. The accounts sat in a space between denial and acknowledgement that confirmed nothing and closed nothing. The absence of a clear denial from people with direct access to Elvis during those years was itself a detail worth noting. His inner circle had a long history of closing ranks around uncomfortable questions, particularly those that touched on his health and the decisions that had been made about managing it. Silence, deflection, and vague statements had been the standard response to sensitive questions for decades. The responses to questions about the passport fit comfortably within that same pattern. The estate of Elvis Presley was informed of the discovery through the appropriate legal channels once the federal review had been completed. Attorneys representing the estate reviewed the documentation and submitted a formal request for the return of the passport as personal property of the deceased. The request was acknowledged, but the passport remained in federal restricted access rather than being released. The stated reason was that the review process had not been formally closed, and that the document could not be transferred, while questions about its provenance remained active. Independent researchers who had tracked Elvis's life in exhaustive detail began working through the calendar for the period covered by the stamp, looking for any evidence that could place him at the name entry point on the date recorded. Travel records, security logs, and private correspondence from that stretch of time were reviewed wherever they could be accessed. The investigation produced several small anomalies in the documentation of his movements during the relevant weeks. None of those anomalies was definitive enough to constitute proof. They were the kind of irregularities that could be explained by bad record keeping. The stamp remained the fixed point at the center of everything. All of the surrounding evidence was either absent or inconclusive. The stamp itself was real, dated, and unaccounted for. It recorded a crossing that the official record refused to acknowledge, and that the people with knowledge of that period declined to either confirm or explain. It sat in the middle of Elvis Presley's documented life like a door that had been left open and then bricked over, visible only because something in the structure of the archive had cracked just enough to let it show. The federal department that had originally housed the document no longer existed. The people who had packed the box that held the passport were unidentifiable. Every thread that the review had pulled had either frayed before it reached a conclusion or had been redirected into a category that was not available for public examination. What remained was not a solved mystery with hidden documentation. What remained was a single travel stamp and a passport that should not have existed, pointing toward a journey that the official record insisted had never taken place. How do you think the passport came about, and what was the reason for its existence?